What do you do when your whole world is about to fall apart? When you're stuck in a hospital ward, counting every breath your tiny baby takes, and the man who swore to love you is off living a secret, high-rolling life with his latest conquest. This is the story of a young Aussie mum who faced the ultimate betrayal, only to discover a shocking secret that would change her and her son's lives forever. But what she didn't know was that a dead man's vengeful plan was about to expose the truth and turn her husband's life into a flaming train wreck. The stale, sterile air of the paediatric intensive care unit at the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne was like a second skin for Amelia. It was a cold that got right into your bones, but it was nothing compared to the chill in her heart. For the last few months, her world had been a grim cycle of beeping monitors, hushed conversations, and the tiny, fragile hand of her 4-month-old son, Noah. His body, so small and defenseless, was hooked up to a complex maze of tubes and wires. The diagnosis, an aggressively advanced case of cystic fibrosis, had hit them like a freight train. Their only hope, a double lung transplant, was an incredibly risky and astronomically expensive procedure, a mountain that seemed impossible to climb. But while Amelia was living this nightmare, her husband, Lachlan King, was on the other side of the city, in a parallel universe where grief and despair simply didn't exist. He was on the rooftop bar of the Adelphi Hotel, sipping on expensive bubbly with a stunning architect named Talia. The sounds around him were the happy chatter of the well-heeled and the gentle thump of electronic music, not the chilling beep of a heart monitor. The only hand he was holding was not his son's, but Talia's. He slid a small little blue box across the table, a glint of diamonds sparkling under the city lights, a shimmery symbol of his treachery. "To our future," he whispered, the words thick with the smell of top-shelf whiskey. Talia smiled a dazzling, complicit smile that promised a world free of complications, hospitals, or sick kids. For Amelia, the very concept of a future had shrunk down to the next few hours. Her life, once filled with the simple joys of a newly married physio, was now all about deciphering medical charts and whispering empty promises to a baby who might never hear them. She'd met Lachlan on a skiing trip in the snowy mountains. He was the golden boy, the heir to the powerful Kingmar developments, and he had swept her off her feet with a captivating charm. He pulled her out of her quiet suburban life and into a universe of lavish dinners, weekends on the Gold Coast, and the promise of a fairy tale love. But the first crack appeared with her pregnancy. Lachlan, who had once excitedly talked about a little heir to the King Empire, became strangely distant. The news of Noah's illness was the final blow that shattered their fairy tale. Amelia saw something die in her husband's eyes that day. Compassion was replaced by cold calculation, love by barely hidden resentment. "We'll work it out," he'd said. But the words were hollow, devoid of any real conviction. The only way he knew how to work it out was to emotionally abandon her. His excuses were always the same: an urgent meeting, a business trip, a client dinner that couldn't be cancelled. The truth was, the only investor he was wining and dining was Talia. While Amelia was living on cold sandwiches from the hospital cafeteria, Lachlan and Talia were dining on degustation menus and flying to tropical islands. He gave Amelia the same line about not having the money for Noah's treatment, something about the economy, company red tape, needing to maintain liquidity. "I can't just pull millions out of the company, Amelia. It doesn't work like that," he'd explained with patronizing patience, as if she was a simpleton who couldn't grasp the intricacies of business. Little did she know the money was being siphoned off to fund a double life, building a future on the ashes of the family he was abandoning. Amelia was adrift in a lonely ocean. Her parents were a whole continent away in Perth, offering impotent emotional support over the phone. The King family, once so welcoming, now treated her with a polite distance. His mother, Beatrice, seemed to blame her sick grandson for her son's unhappiness. Only the patriarch, Arthur King, a man of few words and a piercing gaze, showed any genuine concern. He called every morning, not to ask about Lachlan, but about Noah. It was a tiny lighthouse in a sea of indifference. On that night, as the diamond necklace was being fastened around Talia's neck, Amelia got a visit from the head pediatrician. His words were straight to the point. "Amelia, time is running out. We need to get him on the transplant list now. That means initial costs of almost $1 million for logistics and the team, which the private health fund won't fully cover." $1 million? The number echoed in Amelia's mind, a terrifying thud. Her hands trembling, she called Lachlan. The call went straight to voicemail. She tried again, and again. On the fourth try, he answered, his voice annoyed and muffled by the loud music in the background. "Amelia, I'm in the middle of a really important meeting." "What is it?"
"It's Noah," she choked out. "The doctor says we need the money now. His time is running out."
There was a long pause. Amelia could hear a woman laughing in the background. "Look, I told you I can't just get that amount of cash overnight. The company is going through an audit. I'll see what I can do tomorrow."
"Tomorrow might be too late,"
she cried, her composure finally shattering. "I can't just pull a miracle out of my arse, Amelia. You need to be realistic. Now I've got to go." And then he hung up. The abrupt end to the call felt like a physical blow. The important meeting was more important than his own son's life. The reality he wanted her to understand was that he had made his choice. And the choice wasn't her or Noah. It was Talia, the champagne, the diamonds, and the promise of a life without the burden of a sick kid. Sitting there in the hospital, Amelia finally understood the full dimension of his betrayal. It was more than just physical or emotional. It was a fundamental breaking of the most sacred promise a man can make. He wasn't just absent, he was actively choosing his son's death by denying him the resources to live, while splurging that very money on his own selfish pleasure. The icy feeling in her chest hardened into a cold, steel-like resolve. She would fight for Noah, alone if she had to. She'd move heaven and earth, but she wouldn't let her son die. Little did she know, in a mansion in the Sydney suburbs, an old man, haunted by his own demons, was already setting a plan in motion, preparing a revenge that would echo from the grave. Death rarely asks for permission. Arthur King's was particularly abrupt, a seismic event that shook the foundations of the family and the empire he had built. A massive heart attack took him in the quiet of a Tuesday morning without any goodbyes. The news reached Amelia in a cold, matter-of-fact phone call from Beatrice, her mother-in-law. For Lachlan, the news was a shock, but one that quickly turned into a cold calculation of opportunities. The grief of losing his father was overshadowed by the anticipation of the inheritance. The patriarch was gone, and with him, the last obstacle to his total control over Kingmar Developments and its staggering $80 million fortune. He consoled his mother and made funeral arrangements with a grim efficiency, all while planning with Talia to move into the family mansion and buy a private jet. For him, his father's death was not an ending, but a new beginning. The beginning of the life he believed he deserved. The reading of the will was set for a week after the funeral, in the impressive boardroom of Kingmar's Sydney headquarters, a skyscraper on Collins Street. The room was heavy with a sombre silence. Lachlan was there, looking impeccable in an Italian linen suit, his contained expression of grief barely hiding the impatience of an heir about to take possession of his kingdom. His mother, Beatrice, looked like a fragile porcelain doll beside him. The company's oldest directors and a few distant relatives completed the circle, all expecting it to be a simple formality, the transfer of power and fortune to the only son, Lachlan. Amelia was there too. She almost didn't go, feeling her place was by Noah's side in the hospital, but a persistent call from the family lawyer, a straight-shooting bloke who had been loyal to Arthur for decades, had convinced her. "Your presence is essential, Amelia. It's a specific request from your father-in-law." She showed up, smelling of hospital antiseptic, with a weariness that seemed to have aged her soul. She sat as far away from Lachlan as possible, a small frozen planet in a distant galaxy. The lawyer, a white-haired gent with shoulders slumped under the weight of corporate secrets, cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses. The silence in the room was so thick you could cut it with a knife. "We are here today to fulfill the last wishes of Mr. Arthur King," the lawyer began. "Before I proceed with the main document, I must inform you that an amendment was added and notarized exactly 2 weeks ago, just a few days before his passing." A low murmur swept through the room. Lachlan's brow furrowed in irritation. An amendment? His father hadn't mentioned a thing. He shot a quick glance at his mother, who just shrugged, equally surprised. The lawyer opened a sealed envelope with a silver letter opener, the sound of the paper tearing, echoing like a gunshot. He unfolded the document, his eyes scanning the lines with a gravity that sent a shiver down Amelia's spine. "I, Arthur King, being of sound mind, leave my final decisions on record. The Kingmar Developments Company was built on sweat, integrity, and a fundamental principle, that our legacy is not measured in concrete, but in character. A man who does not honor his own family, who does not protect his own offspring, is not worthy to lead or to inherit." Lachlan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. That moralistic preamble sounded dangerously like the conversations his father had been trying to have with him lately. Conversations he had always dismissed as the sentimental nonsense of an old man. The lawyer paused dramatically, his eyes meeting Lachlan's over his glasses. "Therefore, after a careful and painful investigation into the conduct of my only son, I have decided to irrevocably alter the disposition of my assets." The word investigation dropped into the room like a bomb. Lachlan's blood ran cold. "Mr. King discovered," the lawyer continued, his voice now sharp as broken glass, "that his son, Lachlan King, not only abandoned his wife and his gravely ill son in their moment of greatest need, but also had been systematically siphoning funds from the company, specifically from the account provisioned for family and employee medical emergencies, a reserve that Arthur himself created to ensure no family connected to Kingmar would ever suffer for lack of resources in a health crisis." Amelia's hand flew to her mouth, a choked sob escaping her lips. The image of Lachlan, with his fake patience, explaining the impossibility of getting money for Noah, while he was actually stealing from the very fund created for that purpose, was a cruelty she could barely comprehend. Lachlan's tanned face turned a pale, corpse-like white. He opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. The lawyer gave him no chance. He opened a separate folder and pulled out a stack of papers. The investigation, conducted by a top-notch agency, revealed a pattern of fraud and deceit. We have here bank statements, corporate credit card invoices used for personal, shall we say, romantic expenses. He held up an invoice. Thousands of dollars in dinners, stays in presidential suites, the purchase of high-value jewelry, all paid for with money that should have been available for the treatment of his son, Noah. The silence in the room was now deafeningly accusatory. The directors, once Lachlan's allies, now looked at him with a mix of shock and contempt. Beatrice seemed to have shrunk in her chair, her face in her hands. "In light of this," the lawyer said, returning to the will, "and based on the conviction that the King family's legacy must be one of compassion and responsibility, not of selfishness and cowardice, Arthur King has determined the following changes." He took a deep breath, as if to give weight to the words that were about to drop. "Lachlan King is hereby completely disinherited from all assets, shares, properties, and funds belonging to me or to Kingmar Developments. He will not receive a single cent." A collective gasp went through the room. Lachlan finally found his voice. "This is a joke. It's illegal. My father was senile, manipulated. I'll contest this farce." The lawyer raised a hand, silencing him with a gesture of unquestionable authority. "Your father anticipated that reaction, Lachlan, which brings me to the second and main disposition of the will." His eyes turned to Amelia, and for the first time she saw a flicker of compassion in the lawyer's face. The entirety of Arthur King's inheritance, including his majority stake in Kingmar Developments and all his personal investments, valued at approximately $83 million, will be transferred to an irrevocable trust fund. This fund will have one sole beneficiary, Noah King. The resources are to be used to cover all of his medical expenses, treatments, education, and well-being for the rest of his life without any limit. Ms. Amelia King, as his mother and legal guardian, will be the exclusive administrator of this fund until Noah reaches adulthood. The room spun around Amelia. $83 million. For Noah. It wasn't just money for the transplant, it was a lifetime of security, care, and opportunities she had never dreamed of. It was her son's redemption, delivered by the hands of a grandfather who had barely known him, but who had loved him in a way his own father was incapable of. The tears she had held back for months finally came, not from pain, but from a relief so profound it was almost unbearable. Lachlan, on the other hand, looked like he was about to have a meltdown. He stood up, his face contorted in a mask of pure fury. "I won't accept this. I'm his son. I built this company with him. I'll take this to court. I'll prove he was coerced, that Amelia manipulated him." "I wouldn't advise you to do that, Lachlan," the lawyer interrupted, his voice calm but with a final chilling tone of warning. "Your father, in his wisdom, included an interorum clause, also known as a no-contest clause. It stipulates that if any heir or interested party initiates any legal dispute to contest the validity of this will, Kingmar Development shall be immediately liquidated. The company will be sold, and 100% of the proceeds, along with all of Arthur's personal fortune, will be donated entirely to the Royal Children's Hospital to build a new wing for the treatment of rare childhood illnesses." It was the final blow. The checkmate. Lachlan froze, his hand extended in a gesture of accusation, his body trembling with impotent rage. His father had not only disinherited him, he had boxed him in. Contesting the will wouldn't get him the inheritance back. It would only destroy the family legacy forever, wipe out the company that the directors and relatives present depended on, and brand him not just as an unworthy son, but as the destroyer of the Kingmar Empire. He looked around for an ally, a sympathetic glance, but found only closed, judgmental faces. He was alone, humiliated in front of Sydney's business elite, stripped of his inheritance, his prestige, and his future. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from Talia. "So, my love, can we celebrate now? Can't wait to start our life." Lachlan looked at the screen, at the smiling photo of the woman for whom he had gambled everything, and felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. He hadn't just lost a fortune, he had lost everything. And the fall had only just begun. Lachlan's exit from the Kingmar boardroom wasn't a walk, it was a panicked scramble. He fled down the polished marble corridor, past the oil portraits of his grandfather and father, the painted eyes of the founders seeming to follow him with a silent accusation. Every step echoed his humiliation. The man who had entered that room as the presumptive heir to an $80 million empire was leaving as a pariah. A man whose greed and cruelty had been exposed under the cold, merciless light of truth. He ignored the sideways glances of employees, the sudden silence that fell in the departments he passed through. The news, he knew, would spread through the company and the market like a bushfire. When he reached the private car park, his designated spot, once marked with a Lachlan King Vice President plaque, was already occupied by one of the director's cars. It was a small detail, but brutally symbolic. He no longer belonged there. In the days that followed, Lachlan descended into a frenzy of denial and rage. He holed up in Talia's apartment, which had become a tense, gilded cage, and spent hours on the phone with the most expensive and aggressive lawyers in Sydney. The answer was invariably the same, delivered in tones that ranged from cautious compassion to barely hidden irritation. Lachlan, the in terrorem clause is perfectly legal and ironclad, the fourth lawyer, a specialist in succession law, told him. Your father was meticulous. He had the best legal minds draft this. Any move you make in court will trigger the company's sale. There are no loopholes, no technicalities. It's a mechanism of mutually assured destruction. And you're the only one who's going to be destroyed. Lachlan punched the raw concrete wall of Talia's loft, the sharp pain in his knuckles a welcome relief from the suffocating agony of his impotence. He, the master negotiator, the man who always found a way out, was trapped by his own father's posthumous genius. The humiliation, however, wasn't limited to the legal realm. It infiltrated every aspect of his life, poisoning the air he breathed. The world that had once worshipped him now turned its back. Longtime business partners, men he'd played golf with at the Royal Sydney Golf Club and closed million-dollar deals with, suddenly stopped returning his calls. An invitation to a charity gala, where he was to be an honoree, was indefinitely postponed. His name was quietly removed from the board of two major corporations. Sydney's elite, a community united by both ties of wealth and an unwritten code of conduct, had judged and condemned him. Leaving your wife was a tolerable indiscretion. Abandoning a sick child to die while stealing from your own family was an unforgivable breach of decorum, a stain that all the money in the world couldn't wash away. And now he didn't even have the money. The fall from grace was a public spectacle. A discreet but devastating note in a major newspaper's social column mentioned the surprising twist in Arthur King's will, alluding to character issues that led to the restructuring of the inheritance in favor of his sick grandson. It was enough to pique the media's curiosity. Soon, investigative journalists began to dig. The existence of the private investigation commissioned by Arthur, whose reports were attached to the will as proof of his sound mind, became public knowledge. The sordid details leaked. The dates of romantic trips with Talia that coincided with Noah's surgeries, the invoices for expensive gifts bought with money from the medical fund. Lachlan went from being a respected businessman to a caricature of the modern villain, the heir who let his son die. The business impact was immediate and catastrophic. Kingmar, now under the administration of a transition council led by Amelia and the family lawyer, found itself in a delicate position. Clients and investors, while admiring Arthur's actions, were wary. In his blind rage, Lachlan began spreading rumours in the market, saying the company was unstable, that a physio had no capacity to run an empire, trying to sabotage from the outside what he couldn't take from the inside. It was a monumental miscalculation. The Kingmar Council, to protect the company and Arthur's legacy, hit back. They issued an official statement detailing the reasons for Lachlan's disinheritance, including clear mentions of his financial misconduct and breach of trust. They also announced the creation of the Arthur King Foundation, a project Arthur had already outlined, which would use a percentage of the company's profits to fund treatments for children with rare diseases. The move was brilliant. It transformed the crisis into a story of corporate redemption. Kingmar was no longer the company of the scoundrel heir. It was the company that was rising again on ethical principles, led by a courageous mother and a visionary grandfather. The shares, after a brief dip, stabilized and began to climb. For Lachlan, every piece of news about the new Kingmar's success was like salt in an open wound. He was formally fired from his position, his termination letter delivered by a courier. His corporate credit cards were cancelled in the middle of a dinner with Talia, a moment of humiliation he would never forget. The car he drove belonged to the company and was repossessed. The apartment he lived in before moving in with Talia also belonged to Kingmar, and he received an eviction notice. Within weeks, he went from a man whose wealth was counted in tens of millions to a man without a job, a car, a home, and with a reputation in tatters. His only possession was his arrogance, but that didn't pay the bills. He tried to use his contacts to get a new job, a directorship at another firm. The conversations were always polite, but ended with the same phrase, "We'll review your CV and get back to you." The call never came. No one wanted to associate their brand with the toxic name of Lachlan King. The business elite he had so courted and felt so much a part of had ejected him like a foreign body. He was an anathema, a walking reminder that there are transgressions that money and power can't forgive. The fall was dizzying, and rock bottom still seemed a long way off. Talia's loft, once a sanctuary of passion and promises, quickly transformed into a silent battleground. Where there had once been laughter and the clinking of champagne glasses, a palpable tension now hung in the air, thick as the humidity before a Sydney storm. Talia was a woman who had built her career and her life on precise calculations. She was an architect of futures, both of concrete and steel, and of her own. In Lachlan King, she hadn't seen just a charming man, but an investment project. He was the vehicle for the lifestyle she coveted, a passport to the most exclusive circle of power and wealth. Lachlan's disinheritance wasn't just a setback, it was the total failure of her most crucial investment. Initially, she tried to maintain the facade of a supportive partner. "We'll get through this, my love," she'd say. But her words sounded increasingly hollow, devoid of the conviction she showed when choosing marble for a new project. Her gestures of affection became mechanical, her kisses a cold formality. While Lachlan sank into a swamp of rage and self-pity, Talia observed, analyzed, and recalculated. She watched him waste away on the Italian leather couch, wearing the same designer hoodie, alternating between angry phone calls to lawyers and the apathetic silence of a man watching his life collapse. He was no longer the powerful, confident man who had seduced her. He was a liability, a constant reminder of a monumental miscalculation. The change began subtly. Late meetings at the architectural firm became more frequent. Romantic dinners at home were replaced by excuses about being tired and tight deadlines. Her touch, once a promise of intimacy, was now evasive. Lachlan, immersed in his own misery, was slow to realize that the ground was shifting under his feet yet again. He clung to her like a shipwreck survivor to a piece of driftwood, not realizing the wood was already rotting and sinking. The breaking point came on a rainy Tuesday night. After another day of rejections and closed doors, Lachlan tried to start a conversation about their future. "Maybe we can move out of Sydney, start fresh somewhere else. Perth, maybe. I could get a job as a site manager, something to start over," he rambled, his voice desperate for a spark of hope. Talia, who was applying an expensive facial cream in front of the mirror, stopped and turned to him. Her expression wasn't one of anger or sadness, but of a cold, surgical clarity. "We're not going anywhere, Lachlan. I'm not going anywhere. My career is here. My contacts are here. My life is here." "What about us? What about our future?" he asked, his voice little more than a whisper. Talia let out a short, humorless laugh. "Future? What future, Lachlan? The future you promised me involved a mansion in Vaucluse, not a rental apartment in Perth. It involved being the Mrs. King of the Kingmar Empire, not the wife of a bitter site manager." Every word was a precise, calculated blow designed to wound. "I didn't sign up for this.
she continued, her tone now cutting. I didn't abandon my own principles and ignore your son's situation to end up in a middle-class life counting pennies. I invested in you, Lachlan, and you, my dear, went bankrupt. The brutality of the confession left him breathless. He stared at her, seeing her for the first time not as the sophisticated and passionate woman he thought he knew, but as a predator who, having realized her prey had no more meat on it, was ready to abandon the carcass.
So that's it? The money runs out and you leave? He spat, the pain turning into venom. Don't be naive, she retorted, turning back to the mirror as if the conversation was already boring her. This was never just about money. It was about ambition, about power, about the lifestyle that comes with it. You have none of that to offer anymore. You're a toxic name, a tarnished brand. Staying by your side now would be professional and social suicide. I'm an architect, Lachlan. I build things. I don't cling to demolitions. That night, he slept on the sofa. The next morning, when he woke up, his bags were packed by the door. A box contained the expensive gifts he had given her, including the Tiffany necklace. It wasn't a gesture of returning them, but a final declaration. Those objects now had no value to her because they no longer represented the future she coveted. Expelled from the last refuge he had, Lachlan found himself completely adrift. Without his family's financial support and with his name burned in the market, he was forced to swallow his pride and move into a small rented flat in a modest suburb, paid for with the rest of his personal savings. The Italian suits were replaced by cheap clothes, the 18-year-old whiskey by a six-pack of beer. Loneliness was his constant companion, an echo of his own choices. Months passed. Lachlan got a temporary, almost humiliating job supervising a small renovation, work that at the height of his power he would have delegated to an intern. It was during this time, idly flipping through a celebrity magazine in a supplier's waiting room, that he saw the photo that sealed his isolation. It was a picture of Talia, radiant, at a charity gala. On her arm, with a possessive hand on her waist, was an older, grey-haired man with a satisfied smile. The caption was short and brutal. Architect Talia and magnate Julian, new couple on the scene, announced their engagement at a charity event. The engagement. The word hit him with the force of a punch. Talia hadn't just moved on. She had upgraded. She had traded him for a richer, more powerful man, one without the scandal he carried. She had found her successful investment project. In that moment, sitting in a plastic chair, the smell of cement and dust in the air, Lachlan understood the full extent of his ruin. He hadn't just lost his inheritance, prestige and mistress. He had lost himself. He had become a ghost in his own life, haunted by the ruins of what could have been. The fall had ended. Now only the emptiness remained. While Lachlan's world disintegrated into a silent heap of dust and regret, a universe of hope and rebirth blossomed under the protection of Arthur King's legacy. A few days after the will was read, the family lawyer handed Amelia a sealed personal envelope with the same King family wax seal. Inside, there wasn't a legal document, but a letter written in the firm, yet slightly trembling handwriting of a man confronting his own demons. "My dear Amelia," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it's because my journey has ended and Noah's can finally, truly begin, and it is imperative that you understand why." The letter was a confession, a testament of pain that had spanned decades. In it, Arthur revealed the darkest chapter of his life, a secret he had carried like an anchor in his chest. Long before Beatrice, Kingmar and the fortune, he had a first marriage, a young wife and a daughter named Lucy. The girl, just like Noah, was born with a fragile health condition, a congenital heart disease that required constant and expensive care. The young Arthur, ambitious and terrified by the responsibility, felt trapped.
"I was a coward, Amelia," he wrote. "I saw my daughter not as a blessing, but as an obstacle to my dreams of greatness. And then I did the unthinkable. I abandoned them. I convinced myself it was an act of practicality, that they would be better off without me. It was a lie to soothe a guilty conscience. I never saw them again. Lucy died at the age of 5, and I learned of her death from a newspaper clipping a distant relative sent me.
I built an empire on the foundation of that abandonment, and every brick I laid was a brick on the tomb of my own humanity." The revelation hit Amelia with overwhelming force. Arthur's concern for Noah, his sad eyes, his insistence, it all made sense now. It wasn't just grandfatherly affection, it was a desperate quest for redemption. When I saw in Lachlan the same fear, the same weakness, the same selfishness that defined me as a young man, the letter continued, I knew the cycle had to be broken. Protecting Noah wasn't just about saving my grandson. It was about saving my son's soul from committing the same unforgivable sin that I did. And maybe, selfishly, about finding some peace for my own. The money I leave to Noah is not an inheritance. It is an apology. An apology to Lucy, whom I couldn't save, and an act of faith in Noah, who can now be saved. Use it to give him the life I stole from my first daughter. Break the cycle, Amelia. Show him that the true King family legacy is not what we build, but who we protect. Amelia folded the letter, tears blurring the ink. She wasn't just administering a fortune. She was the guardian of a posthumous act of love, the executor of a redemption that had crossed generations. With the resources now unlimited, the path to Noah's recovery opened up like the Red Sea. Amelia, transformed from a desperate mother into the commander of a rescue mission, mobilized the best medical team money could buy. A private jet, configured as an airborne ICU, flew Noah and a team of specialists to Boston, home to one of the world's most advanced pediatric transplant centers. There, the wait for a compatible donor was agonizing but brief. The transplant, a 12-hour surgical marathon, was a success. When Amelia saw Noah for the first time after the surgery, extubated and breathing on his own with his new lungs, the soft, regular sound of his breathing was the most beautiful music she had ever heard. It was the sound of life, pure and effortless. The following months were a miraculous recovery. Far from the toxic environment of Sydney, in a rented house near the hospital, Amelia and Noah lived in a bubble of progress and discovery. The baby, who had spent most of his short life lying in a hospital bed, now had energy. He learned to roll over, to sit up unsupported, to smile with his whole body. The moment he crawled for the first time, chasing a colourful toy across the living room floor, was a victory as monumental as any skyscraper King Ma had ever built. And then, at 14 months, holding on to his mother's firm hands, Noah took his first wobbly steps. Each step was a defiance of the death sentence he had received, an affirmation of life that echoed his grandfather's faith. Amelia was also reborn. The experience had forged her into a woman of unshakable strength and purpose. She was no longer the young physio dazzled by the world of the wealthy. She was a leader, a strategist, an advocate. Upon returning to Australia with a healthy, rosy-cheeked Noah, she took her place on the King Ma Council, not as a decorative figurehead, but as the company's moral compass. Inspired by Arthur's letter and her son's journey, she presented the plan for the Arthur King Foundation to the board. It wouldn't just be a charity initiative, but the new heart of the company. Using a significant portion of the annual profits, the foundation was created to fund high-cost treatments, provide logistical and emotional support for families with seriously ill children, and invest in research. Arthur's legacy would not just be to protect his grandson,
but thousands of other Noahs and Lucys across Australia. The foundation became a resounding success, redefining King Mar's image and giving a new, profound meaning to its work. Amelia, the mother who had fought alone in a hospital corridor, was now the hope of countless families. The living embodiment that, even in the deepest darkness, the light of a single life can illuminate the path for many others. 2 years went by. Time, that relentless sculptor, had chiseled new realities into everyone's lives. For Noah, they were years of discovery. The boy who had fought for every breath was now running through the garden of the Vaucluse mansion, his crystalline laughter echoing among the trees his grandfather had planted. He was a vibrant, curious child, with a barely visible scar on his chest as the only physical reminder of the battle he had won. His new lungs, a gift from an anonymous donor, filled him with life. And his eyes, the same piercing eyes as Arthur King, shone with a precocious intelligence. He was surrounded by love, the unwavering love of Amelia, the devoted affection of Beatrice, who had found in her grandson the redemption she couldn't give her son, and the care of a team that had become family. For Amelia, they were years of transformation. The physio had given way to a visionary philanthropist. The Arthur King Foundation was now one of the most respected child health support institutions in the country, a beacon of hope for families who, like her once, found themselves lost in the labyrinth of despair. She managed Arthur's legacy with a wisdom that went beyond business, understanding that true fortune wasn't in financial balance sheets, but in lives saved and families supported. She was living proof that a person's greatest strength doesn't lie in avoiding a fall, but in the way they rebuild themselves after being broken. For Lachlan, they were years of a slow-motion freefall. Silence. That was his sentence. After the public humiliation, he had become a ghost. The jobs he managed to get were menial, temporary, and he invariably lost them, corroded by a resentment that made him a bitter and unreliable employee. He lived in a tiny flat on the outskirts of Sydney, a claustrophobic space that mirrored his inner life. The man who once commanded empires was now counting coins for the bus. He saw news about the foundation, about Amelia, about Noah's growth in magazine photos. Each image was a torture, a glimpse of the paradise from which he had been expelled by his own sins. The loneliness and anonymity forced him into a brutal introspection. In the silence of his nights, without the noise of luxury, flattery, or ambition to distract him, he finally began to hear the voice of his own conscience. And what it said was terrifying. It was on a grey autumn afternoon that the past came knocking on the door of the present. The lawyer called Amelia, his voice graver than usual. "Amelia, I've had an unusual contact. It's about Lachlan." Amelia felt a chill. The mention of that name could still cast a shadow. He's not asking for money or trying any legal maneuvers. He's broken in every sense of the word. He's asked through a public defender for one thing, the chance to see Noah. He wants to beg for forgiveness. Amelia's living room, with its panoramic view of the garden where Noah was playing, suddenly felt smaller. Her first reaction was a visceral no, an animal instinct of protection. Why allow that source of pain to get close to her son, the personification of purity and resilience? Beatrice, who overheard the conversation, was adamant. "Never. That man doesn't deserve to breathe the same air as my grandson. He made his choice a long time ago." But Amelia, looking at Noah, who was now trying to get a little bird to eat from his hand, remembered Arthur's letter. Break the cycle of abandonment, bitterness, and resentment. Denying Lachlan this chance wouldn't be protecting Noah. It would be teaching him to hate. It would be perpetuating the pain. True power, she realized, wasn't in barring the door, but in opening it on her own terms, showing her son that forgiveness isn't weakness, but the highest form of strength. "Once, Mr. Lawyer," she said into the phone, the decision solidifying in her voice. "One meeting, in a public place, supervised, and with one condition. He doesn't come to receive forgiveness. He comes to ask for it. Whether Noah forgives him or not will be a decision my son makes when he is old enough to understand. Today, he will only learn that even people who hurt us deserve a chance to apologize."
The meeting was arranged for a reserved area of a park. Amelia arrived with Noah by her hand. The boy, now almost 3, was chattering about the colours of the flowers, and then she saw him. Lachlan was sitting on a bench, and the sight was a shock. The arrogant, impeccable man had been replaced by a hunched, thin, aged figure. His cheap clothes hung loosely on his body, and his gaze, once sparkling with self-confidence, was now that of a frightened animal, laden with the weight of 1,000 sleepless nights. When his eyes met Noah's, he faltered, as if the sight of that healthy, happy child was a light too bright for his darkness. Amelia knelt beside her son. "Noah, remember Mummy told you about your daddy? The one in the photo? He's come to see you and wants to tell you something very important." Lachlan approached, hesitant, and knelt on the grass, putting himself on the same level as the child. Tears ran freely down his face, carving rivers through the dust of a life of mistakes. He couldn't speak. He just looked at the boy, at the miracle he had discarded, at the life he had refused to save. "Hi, champ," he finally managed to say, his voice raw and choked. I'm Lachlan, your dad, and I came here to tell you the most important thing in the world. I came here to ask for your forgiveness." He didn't try to justify himself, didn't make excuses. He just cried, a convulsive sob, the sound of a heart that had finally broken completely. Noah, with the pure innocence of children, didn't see the monster of his story. He saw only a sad man. He looked at Amelia, who gave him a gentle smile, and then turned back to Lachlan. He extended his little hand and touched his father's wet face. He didn't say anything. He just touched. A simple gesture, without judgment, a touch that crossed years of pain and connected the present to the past. In that touch, Lachlan felt the crushing weight of his failure, but also, for the first time, a tiny, fragile, and almost unbearable seed of grace. He wasn't magically absolved. His life didn't change overnight, but something about that encounter broke him in a new way, not through humiliation, but through undeserved compassion. He got up, thanked Amelia with a look that contained a universe of regret, and walked away, back to his life in the shadows. But now, there was a crack of light. The certainty that his son was alive and that, in his small heart, there was no hate. For the first time in years, upon entering his dark flat, Lachlan didn't just feel the crushing weight of his losses, but the light, almost forgotten impulse to deserve the air he breathed. That night, he didn't open a beer. Instead, he picked up a notebook and, with a trembling hand, began to write. Not a business plan, not a strategy for revenge, but a list. A list of steps, however small, to become a man who one day might be able to look at his own reflection without feeling only shame. The journey would be long, lonely, and without guarantees. But for the first time, it had begun. Amelia hugged Noah tightly, the smell of grass and childhood filling her senses. She looked up at the sky as if she could see Arthur King watching over them. The cycle was broken. Noah would grow up knowing that true love is not defined by the absence of flaws,
but by the ability to face them with courage and passion. He would grow up protected, not by walls of money, but by a fortress of unconditional love, with the certainty that he was chosen, celebrated, and loved, even when his biological father had failed. The true legacy of Arthur King wasn't in the name of the company or the millions in the bank. It was right there, in that park, in the hand of a child touching the face of a repentant father, in a mother's choice to teach forgiveness instead of revenge. It was proof that the greatest construction of all is, and always will be, the rebuilding of a human heart.
So, what did you reckon? Did this story grab you right from the get-go? What do you think about the old man's wild plan? Let us know in the comments below what you thought of this yarn and whether you think Lachlan can ever truly redeem himself. And hey, if you loved it, be sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and we'll catch you on the next one.